at the Constitution. So we're going to get into the Constitution a little bit now. Before we do that, let me just point out to you this guided notes that goes along with the presentation I'm going to go through. So in Schoology, you're going to see this key aspects of the Constitution, and you're going to fill these notes out, and then you can get a few points for doing that and taking those notes as we go through the presentation. So here is this presentation on some key aspects of the Constitution. Just a real quick chronology before we get started. Remember, we had the Articles of Confederation first. Those are in place throughout the Revolutionary War, all the way through to the end of the Revolutionary War. Then we had Shays' Rebellion, and Shays' Rebellion was pretty eye-opening for people, and you did the reading and activity about Shays' Rebellion. Now we're ready for the Constitution, and the Constitution emerging in 1787. This is all going to take place at the Constitutional Convention that's going to take place in Philadelphia in 1787. So we have this meeting in Philadelphia. And why do we have this meeting? Well, people were starting to recognize the limitations of the Articles of Confederation. Particularly after the events of Shays' Rebellion, people were starting to be worried that the Articles were not creating a strong enough government to protect people. And so they needed to improve those Articles of Confederation. So they go to Philadelphia. Representatives from all of the 13 states go to Philadelphia to go about revising the Articles of Confederation, improving those articles. That was the original goal and intent of this Constitutional Convention that takes place in the summer of 1787. When they get there, they make two very important decisions when they first get to Philadelphia. These men that are often referred to as the Founding Fathers, they make two decisions. The first one they decide is, let's meet in secret. We want people to have the freedom to say whatever's on their mind and to not be worried about their words being used against them when they go back to their home states or their home communities. We also want people to all agree on whatever our final decision is. And so if we publish and let it be known any internal disagreements we might have, that's going to make it easier for people to attack our finished product. They can literally use our words against us. So let's work in secrecy. We're going to close the windows. They put big shutters over the screen, over the doors, or over the windows, excuse me. Let's make it so that no one can hear what's going on. And we will all agree to do this in secrecy. The second decision they made was it's going to be impossible to revise these Articles of Confederation. If you remember from the Articles of Confederation presentation, the Articles of Confederation required that all 13 states had to agree to any amendments or changes. Well, the founders get to Philadelphia and they realize, even though their original job was to revise those original articles, that was nearly impossible. And instead, they decided to focus on, let's start from scratch. I often equate this to if you're a student and you start to work on a homework assignment and you realize you're doing it totally incorrectly, then it might be easier to just tear it up and start over on a fresh new sheet of paper instead of trying to fix the mess that you'd started to make. And that's basically what our founding fathers did. They said, it's not worth trying to fix this mess that we've made. Let's start over from scratch. So those were their two big decisions. Let's keep everything we do a secret and let's start from scratch. Think today, imagine how controversial it would be if some very important leaders from the different states got together and met in secret and decided to scrap our Constitution and start over from scratch. That would not be something that would be taken lightly. And this was, in the similar way, something that seemed very surprising to people all over the United States at the time. The Constitution was a much more powerful, much stronger document than the previous Articles of Confederation. To have it become more powerful, though, compromise was needed. There were competing interests on either side of a variety of issues that required compromise. And so we tend to think of the Constitution as a document that is really embedded with compromise. And we're going to look at three of the major compromises now. The first compromise was the big states versus the small states. So we've got big states on one side with lots of people versus small states with small populations on the other side. The solution they come up to solve this problem was what we call the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise. The Great Compromise, and you'll learn about this in government class. We don't go into tons of detail here because you're going to cover this in much more depth in government, whether you're taking that this year or you take that next year. The Great Compromise created two parts of our legislature. So our Congress, the people that make our laws, are divided in two. We have the House of Representatives on one side, and you want to get that down for the Great Compromise, which is based in population. And so California, our most populous state today, has 53 representatives. Wyoming, our least populous state, has one because it is such a low population state. So we'll have that for the big states. They'll get their House of Representatives. Then for the small states, they're going to be rewarded with the Senate. The Senate is the other part of our Congress that makes laws. In the Senate, you're going to get 2 senators per state, no matter how big or small you are. So California, with all of its population, still has 2 senators, just like Wyoming with its very small population. So that was a way to compromise between big and small states. The second compromise, in the South, slavery was a huge part of the way of life in the economic system, whereas in the North, slavery was not used because it wasn't economically profitable. It would be wrong to assume that people in the North had evolved in any way ethically or morally and decided that those were the reasons to get rid of slavery. It's a much better interpretation of history to think of those people as recognizing, yeah, slavery, I can't make money with slavery. And if I can't make money with this system and I look at it more closely, I realize, yeah, this is a pretty bad system anyway. It's not very fair ethically or morally. I shouldn't be involved in slavery. But that decision is a lot easier for Northerners to make when they also can't make money with slaves. Southerners, where slavery became very profitable, had a much harder time coming to those same conclusions. And we recognize how money will often motivate us. Well, how do we solve this problem? And the big question became, how do we count population? If we're going to have this House of Representatives based in population, then Southerners would want to count their slaves as a part of their population. But another thing we're going to count population for is taxation. And Southerners didn't want to count their slaves for how many taxes they had to pay. Northerners wanted the exact opposite. They didn't want to count slaves in terms of voting, but did for taxation. So what's the solution? Well, the solution they come up with is probably not great for everyone and definitely shows the way that slaves were viewed at the time. Let's have what we call the 3/5 compromise. This compromise said we're going to count each slave as 3/5 of a person. So for every 5 slaves, it's going to count as 3 people. And that will be both for taxation and for representation. You can tell here that this was a way to try and solve this problem, and it did solve that problem, but at the expense of, first off, dehumanizing a whole race of people, and then also embedding into our Constitution this idea of slavery, which is in our Constitution and is not removed until the 13th Amendment and the Civil War ending in 1865. Our third big compromise that's needed is between our state governments and the federal government. The United States, under the Articles of Confederation, was a very loose confederation of states that just worked together to govern themselves when necessary, but the states maintained all of their power. Now, with this new government, the states are going to still have power, but now the federal government is going to be much more powerful. Well, how do we maintain that balance? How can we balance that out? That's where this idea of federalism is going to come in. And federalism is a big part of our life today. You guys are all vaguely aware of federalism when you think about the different laws and taxes that you have to pay. Think about different laws. If you're mad about having to take U.S. history as a graduation requirement, you're not upset at President Trump because he has nothing to do with that decision. You're upset with the state of Colorado who makes that decision. If there's a pothole on your street, again, you're not mad at the president and probably not the state. Now you're worried about our local government not maintaining our roads. If you're mad that we're involved in some military action, you're not mad at our state or local government, you're mad at the federal government. And so we have these different layers. That's called federalism. And this was a way where the states maintained certain powers. And so in the state of Colorado, the state has control over education completely. And that was given to the states under this federalism system. But then other powers, like the power to declare war and be involved in foreign affairs, that was reserved for the federal government. And so federalism shows that we have these different layers of government, not the branches of government, that's all part of federal, but these layers of government where we have state government, local government, and then federal government under federalism. Here are some of the main big principles of the Constitution. So you have this chart in the notes, but some of these ideas are the big ideas we talk about. The first one's popular sovereignty, that the people are the voice of the government, the people have the power. We have a limited government. The Constitution puts limits on how much power the government has. We separate the federal government's power into branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. And like I said, again, in government, you'll go into way more detail on those branches. We have this federalism system. Here it is again. We have a federal government and then state and local governments that share different powers. Checks and balances. The Congress can check the power of the president. The president can check the power of the courts. And the courts can check the power of Congress. And they can all check one another's powers, which goes along with this idea of separation of powers. And then finally, representative government, that we're going to pick officials to represent us, that we're not going to be ruled by some elite class, but the people themselves are going to make up the leadership. A few of the key aspects of the Constitution that I want to point out are going to be things that are going to come up later this year over as we study history. There's all kinds of other unique aspects of the Constitution that I find very interesting, and you're going to look at in a ton of depth in your government class. But here are the few big things you need to know about for a U.S. history class. The first one is the Supremacy Clause. Here is the Supremacy Clause. This is directly from the Constitution. It says, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land." That's the key word right there, the supreme law of the land. "And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, and anything in the Constitution or the laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." So basically, here's the key thing. Our Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So if in the city of Aurora, we decide that racist speech is a huge problem for our city, and we're going to outlaw racist speech in the city of Aurora, and the city council agrees, and the mayor agrees, and Aurora citizens overwhelmingly agree, and we decide and we pass a law in Aurora. Well, according to the Supremacy Clause, that law would not be allowed to stand, because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and the Constitution guarantees freedom of speech. So we couldn't create a law in the city of Aurora that would outlaw racist speech without first changing the Constitution. That's the Supremacy Clause. It's the most important document in our country. The second really important clause is this idea of the Elastic Clause. The Elastic Clause says that the Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Again, here's the key words here: necessary and proper. This is one of those things where the founders rightly acknowledged that we're making this document in the 1780s. The world is going to change dramatically over the next course of years, and we can no way predict those changes. So we are going to give the government this elasticity. Think about the elastic in your pants that stretches your pants out and makes them comfortable no matter the size of your waist. We're going to allow elasticity to our Constitution as well, and we can do things that are necessary and proper. So the Constitution says that the government has the ability to regulate interstate travel or interstate commerce, which is trade between states. The Constitution doesn't say anything about the government having power to regulate air travel, because that didn't exist when the Constitution was written. But because of the Elastic Clause, the federal government today does regulate air travel based on this necessary and proper view and elasticity of the Constitution to incorporate this trade that's now going on in the sky, which is not something that they would have ever imagined. Here is just some final information, kind of a final flow chart that shows you some things here. So we had the Articles of Confederation. They were not being very effective. Shays' Rebellion showed some of those problems. There's the strain as economic problems were hurting the country. So there's this meeting at the Constitutional Convention, and there they establish a new government with 3 branches, with 2 houses in the legislature, with checks and balances, and confidence in our government then is going to increase. This Constitution is ratified in 1787. The one big complaint and the one kind of part that was left out is this Constitution gave much more power to the federal government, but it didn't give any more powers to the individual people. That's corrected when the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, you want to get that down for the Bill of Rights, it's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, they're added in 1789. And then they're ratified or officially accepted as part of the document, all 10 together at once, in 1791. So things like your freedom of speech, your right to bear arms, your freedom of assembly, your rights if you're accused of a crime, all of these rights were now guaranteed to citizens when the Bill of Rights is added in 1791. We talked about those rights. I just listed some of those, and you'll go into way more detail. This is a huge focus in a government class whenever you take that class, and you have to take that class before you graduate. But that pretty much covers all the key concepts you need to know about the Constitution. So remember, our first shot at government was the Articles of Confederation. It fails, doesn't last for very long at all. It's replaced by the Constitution. And the Constitution is going to do much better, in part because the people that write the Constitution are able to convince George Washington to run and serve as the first president and be a supporter of this Constitution. And because George Washington is so popular, this Constitution becomes popular as well. And it's still the government form that we use today in the United States. We've changed it over time and made it reflect more of our current world, but it is still our form of government in the United States today. All right, so next we're going to look